Hey, welcome everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Steve Sullivan. I started working professionally in role-playing games in September of 1980 when I joined the staff of TSR as an editor. And I worked on Moldvay Cook Basic and Expert and Top Secret and Gamma World and Boot Hill, basically everything that they put out for a while. And then I moved into the art department where I worked on even more stuff and did a lot of maps and graphics, including Dwellers in the Forbidden City that people like a lot. Later left and joined Pacesetter Limited, the creators of Chill and other fine role-playing games, and then became a freelancer. Came back working in TSR freelance. I did Dragonlance maps. I did maps for the Twins Dragonlance trilogy, many other things. I also worked in comic books. I wrote Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and a number of other very cool things, Disney Afternoons, all sorts of stuff, and eventually made my way into writing novels, and wrote a trilogy of novels for The Legend of the Five Rings, which was then under license to TSR, as well as a number of Dragonlance novels. And I continue to freelance, and in theory, I work for TSR, WotC, Hasbro today, though they haven't sent me any royalty checks in a long time. But that all started in 1980. And very near the beginning of that, I was one of the people that worked on the Dungeons & Dragons Comics Ads. And it's a pretty cool and interesting story. And I wasn't aware that there was kind of a lot of cult interest in the D&D Comics Ads until last year, I think it was, after GaryCon. I just stumbled into an article online talking about the ads, and I was like, oh, wow, people are interested in this. And followed down the rabbit hole, and I found out not only were people interested in this, people were really interested in this. And not a lot was known about it at the time. There was a lot of speculation going around, and so I started chiming in on some of the chat boards and correcting some assumptions and trying to bring history back in line with what I knew and what I had experienced at the time. In case it's not obvious from what I've said by now, I was one of the three people that did most of the TSR Marvel Comics ads. The other two people were my friend Jeff D., who drew the first one and then did some lettering, and Bill Willingham, with who I did most of the rest of the series. And the trick was that the first one was done by completely different people. And the way that came about is that way back in those dark ages of the early 1980s at TSR, which were actually a golden age too, the executive office building and the office building where the entire creative division worked in the company were separated across the city. The creative division was in the old Hotel Claire downtown above the Dungeon Hobby Shop. The Dragon magazine was in the gray house next to the Pizza Hut, kind of in the middle of the trek out to the I think it was an old LRP building, but it was an old office building out on Sheridan Springs Road that TSR had taken over. Now, if you go out there now, people will show you the TSR office building on it. Sheridan Springs Road. This was not that building. This was the crappier building that was a number of doors down and much smaller, but it had offices. It had a fairly small warehouse. And when all this was going on at the beginning of the 1980s, that's where the executives for TSR were. And that included Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom. And importantly for this story, it also includes the people in marketing and advertising. And the head of advertising, I don't remember if they were calling it right then, was a guy named Dave Dimery, who was one of Gary's friends. I think they may have grown up together in Chicago. So they were old companions. And Dave worked out of there. And at some point, Dave came up with the idea, and it may have been him alone, or it may have been him and Gary, came up with the idea that it would be cool to run ads for Dungeons & Dragons in Marvel comic books. Now, this was kind of a really out of the box idea for them. D&D had started to take off. We'd released the basic and expert sets. At that point, the whole hobby was really starting to grow along with us. But Marvel Comics was Marvel Comics, and that was a big ad ask at the time. It was expensive. I don't know how expensive, but if you're putting an ad that runs in every single Marvel comic, that had to be a pretty good chunk of money, especially compared to the kind of ads that TSR would usually run. You know, that's certainly much more than running ads in their own house org Dragon magazine. So they came up with this idea, and Dave thought it was pretty good, and he took it to the executives, and Brian and Kevin Bloom and Gary were running the company at the time, and the Blooms were against it. You know, I was friends with Brian Bloom. He's a really nice guy, but he and his brother together, they weren't interested in this really at all. But Gary was very interested in it. And so Gary managed to persuade everyone that Dave should try this crazy idea that he had. So unfortunately, all of the principals are now dead. So at that point, we only have the remembrances of those of us that are still alive. Dave Dimery. Yeah, he was, I can see questions coming up. So this is Dave Dimery, and he is the father of Eileen Dimery, who's a friend of mine. Dave's no longer with us. The ad department people who worked on it are still there, but at this point, it's Dave, and he's gotten permission to make this ad. So at the time, TSR was using an ad department out of Chicago, one by the name of Ray Cione. And again, he's gone, so I don't know for sure that that's how he pronounced his name. But he was down there, and it was a kind of a versatile art and animation studio. So they did, the Game Wizard stuff. They'd worked on that. They were responsible for creating Morley, who was much hated in the TSR art department later. But that was their job. They got this ad request from Dave Dimery, and what they came up with was this, which is the original Dungeons and Dragons ads that probably a lot of you saw in Marvel Comics back in 1981. And because people were interested in this, I actually have taken some time and done some restoration work on all of these advertisements, so you don't have to look at exactly how they came out of the comic books that were scanned. So I've brightened it up a little. It's still not completely pleased with the restoration, but it's a much clearer thing to look at and see what we're talking about. So this is the famous or the infamous original TSR comic book ad. And this was done by Ray's studio, and we believe it was probably executed by a guy named Kurt Davis Mitchell, who is also no longer with us. Kurt worked in Ray's studio, and he did the cover for Dragon magazine of a really super ugly witch. And that style seems to match this style. So though this particular piece of art is not signed, we're pretty sure that Ray assigned this and Kurt actually did the execution. We don't know for sure. We don't know for sure who actually wrote this original ad. It may have been Dave. It may have been Ray. It may have been both of them working together. It's just not clear at this point. But this ad was sent from the headquarters of TSR down to Chicago. They made the ad. They did all the stuff you have to do to get into Marvel Comics. They paid a huge sum of money. They sent it to Marvel Comics, and Marvel Comics printed it in every ad in their line early in 1981. Now, you remember that I said that TSR's creative division and executive division were in two completely different buildings. I think we were about 2 miles apart. It's a little bit of a drive from one side of town to the other. I mean, literally kind of as the far ends of town. So none of us in the creative department which was, as you'll recall, downtown on the 3rd floor and 2nd floor of the Dungeon Hobby Shop building, the old Hotel Claire, had any idea this was going on until the next month's comics came out. And then someone brought one into the office. And I don't remember who it was. My memory is saying it may have been Lawrence Schick or Tom Mulvey. And they brought the thing in. They were like, hey, we got an ad in Marvel Comics. Take a look at it. And it was kind of like, we don't think a whole lot of this. It's like, oh, those crazy executives, what are they doing now? And so they showed it around, and people had kind of a laugh over it. It was like, oh man, this is not what we would have done. Had they asked anyone in our division, we were fully capable of doing this, but they didn't ask anyone in our division. And my memory of the time is that most of the people there were just like, oh, well, that's what happens. This is, we don't have any control of this. But a lot of us were fiery, angry young men at the time. I was one, and Bill Willingham and Jeff D were two of the others. And Bill, Jeff, and I all had a comics background. We were all intensely into comics and collecting. Jeff, of course, had written Villains and Vigilantes with Jack Herman at that point. So he even had a comic book-like role-playing game to his credit. And we were all friends. And talking with Bill and Jeff was like, well, this isn't right. We need to do something about this. Why didn't they ask us? And here's another place in this is, again, 42 years ago at this point, where memories differ somewhat. I remember that Jeff convinced us all to go down to headquarters, and we all went down. Bill Willingham remembers it as Jeff went down to TSR headquarters and then came back and reported. Jeff doesn't remember it at all because it's a long time ago and we were young. In any case, it may be that he talked to them on the phone and then we all went down. I have a memory of going down. We didn't talk to Dave Dimery because working under Dave Dimery were two really wonderful young women that were closer to our age. You have to picture now that Dave's generation and Gary's generation, they're 10 or 15 years older than Bill, Jeff, and I are. So they're literally kind of a different generation than we are. And the two people that were working in the ad department under Dave Dimery were Dagmar Simonet and Gail Gurhan. Dagmar Simonet is now Dagmar Knorr, having married Bryce Knorr, who used to work in Dragon. So Gail and Dagmar were the people that Bill, Jeff, and I went down and saw. And we'd thought this through, and Jeff was very passionate about it. And we explained to them why they should have had us do the comic books rather than sending them out of house to people that really didn't know the game. If you look at the original ad, it has trappings of the game and pieces that feel like the game, but in a very real way, it doesn't feel like the game either. So we gave them this whole little presentation, and much to our surprise, they were like, okay, great, you guys do the next one. Now, I've been thinking about this over the last couple of days as I prepared this, and part of me thinks, I bet we were a lot cheaper than the advertising agency in Chicago that they were using. In any case, for whatever reason, they gave us the ad assignment. They were like, great, we have 3 more ads. We bought 4 ads. There are 3 more. You guys do the next one. And we're like, awesome. And I believe this was probably the first comic book work that any of us actually did professionally. Jeff had done comic book-like things for V&V, of course. But for Bill and me, aside from anything we might have done in college newspapers or military newspapers, this was our first chance. So we sat down and we talked a little bit. And my memory is that we worked something between a Marvel style and a DC style. And Marvel style, generally the artist and the writer talk out a plot. The artist gives writes up a plot, delivers it to the artist draws it, and then the writer actually puts the words into the balloons. The DC style, you write a complete script that says page 1, panel 1, and then you have a description of what's going on, and then you have the balloons as separate things called out. So we did somewhere in between there, maybe somewhere in my massive files, I still have notes for those from those first things, but I couldn't find them quickly when I looked for them over the last year. So in any case, we made a couple of decisions. We had to make the party a little more interesting. I was concerned that there were no women in the party, so I created a female character called Sarin. She would be a cleric because we had a fighter, an elf, and a mage in the group. And in D&D, an elf was a character class, was kind of had thief-like abilities, but we weren't really concerned with being really strictly adhering to the game. We were more concerned with the spirit of the game. So we needed a cleric because you always had a cleric in your party, and we needed a woman because you should have women in your party too. There were women in every gaming group I've ever been in. We decided between the three of us the way it would work was I would write it, and Jeff would draw it, and then Bill would ink it, and Jeff would letter it. Jeff had been to the Kubert School, as I recall, and thus he had actual trained comic skills as well as a massive amount of self-learning and work. So this seemed like the logical way to do it, and it was a pretty good division of labor. Bill doesn't really remember what happened in that first comic, but I'm dead sure that was the plan, and that's what we decided to do. What we ended up with is this. And that is the first comic that I scripted in this series. And from then on, I was the writer of the series right to the end. If you look at it, I don't want to, boast too much, but I think it's a big step up from the original ad. And as Bill pointed out, Bill has a talk about this on YouTube in one of his chatting while he draws things. He talks about how good Jeff D's layouts and drawings are for this. And I think it looks terrific. Now, because of the way things worked in comics, and because certainly in my experience, there was back and forth about the dialogue. Jeff would edit things down so that there was enough room. There are, I think, 7 or 8 panels in this. And when you count the fact that there has to be a little ad down in the corner there, you can see, as a professional comic book writer, I would never write this many panels for this kind of a situation nowadays. Our hope was to carry on the spirit of the ads. We decided that it wouldn't be a continuation. I don't remember if that was a requirement. So we picked up right from where the last story ended up. Serial forms, being comic books, serial forms were very, very familiar with all of us, and it's something we really enjoyed doing. So we dived right into it at that point and took it down to Gail and Dagmar, and they were super pleased. And they had an extra full-size stat. It's maybe a little blurry or not perfect in some way, and so they actually gave me a full-size stat of that original comic that Bill, Jeff, and I did with the note in the corner that says thanks. So I'm really pleased I've managed to hang on to that all these years. So now we've got the job, and they're enjoying the job. And we just get to run with it. Now, this would have been really wonderful and fun, except at that point, there was new rules. New rules were that TSR was starting to become very concerned about their public relations at this point, because we're kind of at the start of the satanic panic, and that was starting to build. And so the ads had to represent kind of the best of what TSR thought people should think Dungeons & Dragons was, even if that maybe wasn't entirely what Dungeons & Dragons was. So we were off plotting our new strip, the third in the original series. We planned to have a goblin fight. We planned to do some other cool things like that. and, you know, just the kind of general dungeon stuff that you do on these kind of things. And we got a call from Gail and Dagmar, who were, again, very pleasant. I love those ladies to this day. They're wonderful. And they were like, okay, we have some things. We have some notes, as they would say in Hollywood. You can't actually be violent in the comic, which I think they may have told us before. But you also can't loot treasure. So back in those days, what D&D was largely about was you went down into a dungeon, you fought the monsters, you took the treasure, and off you went and did it again, right? But now we can't do any of that in the ads. The ads have to be essentially a non-violent ad about a kind of violent game, and there can't be any looting done because, well, violence provides violence in real life. Don't you know that? Everyone knows that. We don't want people to think it's a violent game. And taking treasure from monsters, well, that's stealing. We can't promote stealing. So we can't have those things. Which means that in the case of a comic like this, we have our guys, and Indel has fallen through a trapdoor. The other three characters are looking for him. They encounter some goblins, which they can't really fight. And then they kill them, but not really, without really killing them. And then we move on, because one of the tricks with serials is you have to recap what happened, you have to advance the story, and then you have to move on to the next thing. At that point, Jeff, who was very much a in or out guy, you're either in or you're out. Jeff was like, no, I'm out. I won't do that. If we can't have a game with fighting and taking treasure, I'm not going to draw it anymore. And Bill and I were like, well, okay, Jeff, if that's the way you feel about it. It's like, yeah, we have to make a stand. I'm like, yeah, but we want to keep doing the comic. And he's like, okay, I'll help you later, but I'm not going to do it anymore. And this is long enough ago, and it's a small enough portion of Jeff's life. Jeff doesn't remember any of this. But for me, anyway, it was like, hey, I'm a comics writer. Hey, I'm not a comics writer because Jeff's leaving. But fortunately, Bill was right there. And Bill's like, I can do it. And so we're like, awesome. Okay, Bill, you and I are doing this from now on. Jeff did hang around, and he did letters for at least one or two more, I think, which was helpful because I've never been any good at lettering. This is long before we actually got such things as computers to letter comics. And Bill, he got better at lettering. He actually got very good in the end. But at this point, remember, this is all our first work. And at the time, I thought, wow, this looks really great. This is going really well. And it is, and it does. But as Bill pointed out in his own video, it's kind of a big step backwards in some ways from Jeff's very polished and really knows what he's doing layouts. So Bill and I are kind of groping our way through this whole thing together. And you can see, even in the coloring, which Bill also did, is very different from the coloring in the first one. It's much less complex. But on the other hand, we're doing well. We're doing well. And the other thing I didn't point out is that if you look at the coupon in the bottom, the coupon has started to grow. And it actually takes up more space than it did when we originally started, which, of course, we didn't know was going to happen until after I'd written the scripts and worked with Bill to get the thing worked out. So Bill and I are on our own. Jeff is helping with the lettering, but the whole ad campaign is still going just great guns. D&D is selling like hotcakes. We're getting a lot of people to mutilate their comics, cutting out that ad down in the corner and sending them into TSR for a free catalog. What more could you ask? Well, what more could you ask is that there's one more story in this series, because if you remember, when they hired us, they bought 4. They had, we've now done, they had 1, we did 2. There's one more in this series. And it's this one. This is the last of the Dungeon series in the first D&D ads. And the I think it looks beautiful. The step up in Bill's art from the previous one to this one, I think is really obvious and really palpable. You can see Bill's really starting to figure it out now. He's really starting to cook on all this stuff. And his color guides have gotten much better. When I did the restoration on these, most of which I'm very happy with, this one and the first one we did, Bill, Jeff, and I did together, I needed to do very little stuff. And I was like, oh, I tried them first and was like, hey, this is easy. And then, well, the other ones were harder to restore. But hopefully they're good enough that you can get a decent look at them. The trick of this story is that we've had dungeons. We need a dragon. We introduced the dragon at the end of the last thing. Now we need to get rid of the dragon without actually fighting the dragon. Because if you remember, you can't fight and you can't loot, which is most of D&D. But fortunately, I'd set this up during the story, knowing this was coming. Had decided that, well, what we could do was we could threaten the dragon. So we threaten the dragon with the magic dragon slaying sword. We assume it's a dragon slaying sword. We never say that. And the dragon says, hey, you guys can go. We don't make any mention of the treasure. And everyone goes home happy ever after. And the ads are still going great guns. Everyone's enjoying it. People love this comic. I love this comic. People start saying, hey, you should do a D&D comic. And we start saying that to TSR. And TSR says, no, we're not doing comics. It's too complex and too expensive for us and that kind of stuff. But we're done with the first series of ads. And so we go in and we're like, okay, are we doing more? And they're like, yes, we're buying 6 more. So you guys can come up with a 6-episode story and we will do 6 more ads and then we'll see where it goes from there. We're like, awesome. Yeah, they weren't paying us very much. I don't remember how much it was, but it was not a lot of money. But it was freelance work from the company, and so it was a little extra cash on top of our meager paychecks. I think both Bill and Jeff had left the company by this point, and were working freelance and on other things. I was still there. When I started working at TSR, I think I was making maybe 25 cents or 35 cents an hour, which meant that over the course of a 2-week period, I was taking home maybe $200, $250. It was like one of my paychecks every month had to go to my rent, and then the rest. So even a little bit of extra money was actually kind of a cool thing, and fun to have. And working in comics is like, my stuff is in Marvel Comics, which turns out to be very good because a lot of people love these comics and started playing the games for them. I was in a speaking engagement with John Jackson Miller, and we were asked what our first comics work was, and I said this, and John Jackson Miller was like, "That was you? I started playing D&D because of those." Like, score. So we've got another contract, and we've got more stories to tell. And Bill and I decided that since we did Dungeons the first time, we will do a wilderness adventure this time. And that means we're going to change things up. We're going to do some more exciting stuff. We decide the logical thing is, after the last, where do all wilderness adventures start? Where do almost all D&D adventures start? Well, they start in the inn. So we put the guys in the inn. We gave them a quest, something to do, to go and save their mentor, and we're off and rolling. So we do this ad, and it's still going really well. We're having a good time. Bill is learning more and more about how to make really great-looking comics. His coloring's getting better. We continue. We get our guys out of the inn with their quest, and Bill turns in this absolutely gorgeous comics page for the next ad. This is ad number 6 in the series. At this point, I feel like we're really cooking on gas, and beware, pride goeth before a fall. We're doing great. Seems to be doing really well with the advertising department. They're not talking about replacing us. We've totally cemented our role in doing this. We get this great looking thing, which has a druid and a werewolf. Oh, we had another one of these moments with the advertising department and the Satanic Panic. at this point in the series, in the second series, and I think probably right about now, they were like, you can't really say spells anymore because spells are magic. Magic is associated with Satan. And so you can do spells, but don't call them spells. Don't mention spells. Oh, and that druid guy, don't say he's a druid because that's a non-Christian religion. And we're having trouble with these people. And so just don't do us a favor and just don't. Okay. And we're like, yeah, okay. Oh, and by the way, that cleric of yours, don't call her a cleric either, okay? So Saren is now she's now a healer. She's not a cleric anymore, even though she's still a cleric. And at this point, there were some people who were like, are these two werewolves? Who are these people fighting? Well, it's a druid and a werewolf who has a bow, which is pretty cool. And again, we're not using strict D&D or AD&D rules. We're just trying to capture the feel of the game, which seems to be working because a lot of people are cutting up these ads and sending them in to get their free catalog from TSR. We thought we were going pretty well. Something went wrong. My memory is that Bill ended up needing to condense or change some of the action in the next comic. And I can't say for sure what it was. It may just have been that he was having the what Marvel used to call the dreaded deadline doom. It may be that there was some kind of a problem with the lettering, at which point I believe he was doing all the lettering at this point. It's still a pretty darn good comics. It's got a lot of adventure in it. And it contains that essential moment of wilderness adventure, which is traveling. We are traveling through the wilderness to get to our next thing. And the next thing that we get to is this one, which is episode 8. And episode 8, I wrote it. I sent it to Bill. I think it had about 6 or 7 panels in it, which was what we figured we could handle at the time. And so he was not living in Lake Geneva, so we were working by the phone and mail and that kind of stuff. And I get a call from Bill that's like, Steve, I'm sorry, I had to make some changes at this. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about, Bill? He's like, the ad has grown again. And sure enough, the coupon down in the corner, if you remember what it looked like in the last episode and in the first episode, the coupon has gone from occupying a small corner in the bottom of the page to now taking up, it's probably approximately a third of the page. And that made Bill take whatever wonderful subtle storyline I had and distill it down to just a few things. We hashed out some of the dialogue and sent it off, and then we're like, okay, well, we'll figure this out. And at that point, we got a call from Gail and Dagmar, and they said, the ad series we're not going to do it anymore. They've dropped the ad series. The executives have decided that the comics ads in the comics are going to stop. I didn't mention it at this point, but at some point during the second series, Bill had also started doing a series of epic comic ads, pretty much on his own. He thinks I may have helped with a couple of them, but I don't remember it that way. And they were pretty darn beautiful ads because Bill has gotten to be a really good comics artist at this point, having escaped from TSR and doing a lot of work. He's doing great work. And suddenly the story has stopped. It's just, and I'm like, well, can we have one to wrap it up? They're like, no, it's done. And we're like, oh, so what are you going to do? They're like, well, they think now that you shouldn't actually have comics in as an ad in a comic book because you want your ads to contrast with the stuff around. So we're just going to do standard full page ads, which basically Bill and I are out of work on the comics. And that is the end of the comics. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, and with 2 planned comics to go that we never actually got to produce. And the strange thing is that the sudden stoppage of the comics has engendered all sorts of weird fan theories about the comics, like the idea that, and I love this, the idea that this comic loops back to the first comic. So the heroes leave here and end up walking into the first comic, and the whole thing just cycles back and forth. I love that. The truth is much sadder and much stranger, and the truth is that they dropped the ad campaign. They decided they were going to do something different, and that was the end of the comics. And it was the end of the comics until pretty much recently, when a private collector talked to Jeff D. Jeff's been doing recreation of his comic book work, and a private collector talked to Jeff D. recently and said, "Hey, Jeff, would you be interested in redoing those old comic ads that you and Bill and Steve worked on?" And Jeff said, "Yeah, I'd be interested in doing that if Steve could come and work on them." And so here's a special sneak preview for you guys. I don't know if this is ever going to go anywhere outside of this private collector's hands, but Bill didn't have time, but Jeff and I are doing rewritten and reimagined versions of the old comic book ads right now. And if you see down in the bottom right-hand corner, we actually have gotten rid of the ad, so we have more story to play with. I'm very excited about that. It's a lot of fun. We're hoping to maybe find a way to publish it in future, and if you clamor for it, certainly we'll work hard on it. But that is it. That is the secret origin of the D&D comic ads. Thank you very much. It's been great being here. I hope you've had a really good time. Enjoy the rest of GaryCon. Check out my stuff at sdsullivan.com. And thanks. Have a great one.